Herr Schnee, I've just come from the king. And the king says that he wants to meet you and talk to you about his photographs. And he would be willing to sell them to Ambassador College. But he said, before you come, could you bring something over so that I could go to the king and explain to him what Ambassador College is, the Plain Truth magazine, and who this man Herbert Armstrong is? And I said, certainly, I'll come right over tomorrow. And when I went, this time I took the 1966 envoy with me. Now this was in 1968. And the biggest envoy that had appeared to that time was this 1966 issue. And I took this envoy and I went through it page by page with Herr Roland and described to him what Ambassador College is and the work of God and Mr. Armstrong and what our goals are, what we hope to accomplish, and so on. And the next day, Herr Roland then went to the king and explained the envoy to him as good as he could after I had shown him the envoy. Then Herr Roland came back to me, and Herr Roland said, after seeing the envoy, the king would rather meet Mr. Armstrong. Of course, my vanity wasn't hurt, except maybe a little. But he said, King Leopold wants to meet the man that has raised up this fine college. Yes. And so I had a tiger by the tail now, because I had not even told Mr. Armstrong anything of what had gone before. So I called him up. He happened to be in England at the time. And I remember my opening sentence was, I hope I haven't done anything wrong, Mr. Armstrong. And he said, oh, what have you been into now? And I said, well, Mr. Armstrong, we have an invitation for you to meet King Leopold. And then I went on to explain how it all came about, and he said, well, you haven't done anything wrong. But he said, I'm not sure I'm going to go. I'm going to look into it first. And then about a week later he said, well, I've got all the facts, and he said, I've decided to go, so you can tell King Leopold we would be happy to accept his invitation. It was quite a thrill to go with Mr. Armstrong into the king's palace and to be received by his servants. We were ushered into a waiting room, and then within a few minutes we were brought into a large drawing room. I remember the king sitting at a small coffee table with chairs of padded furniture, very elegant. The king motioned us to come near and greeted us, shook hands, and asked us to sit down. And then quite a shock came, because the opening sentence that the king spoke was, Mr. Armstrong, why have you come to see me? And I thought, well, ghastly, doesn't he know he has invited him? What have I gotten Mr. Armstrong into? But Mr. Armstrong, very calm and collected, just said, well, I understand that you've had a look at our 1966 envoy describing Ambassador College, and that Herr Schnee has shown that we have an interest in your color photographs, and that you have actually invited me to come here. And the king said, yes, that's right. And a few more sentences were exchanged, and it seemed a very short while, and the king said, well, let's go down to my hobby room and let's look at some of my favorite slides. And I remember he showed us about 125 color slides, again from all over the world. And of course Mr. Armstrong was really elated to think that we could have such photographs for the Plain Truth magazine. And it was soon after this first visit that Mr. Armstrong made to King Leopold that he was invited back again. And Herr Roland told us later that it was a rare thing that a guest would be invited on the second visit already to meet the family and to have dinner with the family. Finally, I remember King Leopold visiting our college in Bricket Wood in England, and then later visiting the college at Pasadena and speaking to the student body. And of course a very deep friendship developed, and then from there King Leopold introduced Mr. Armstrong to other personages in high office, and Mr. Armstrong began visiting leaders all over the world. And it's so hard to believe now, but you can see that God always provides the right people at the right time. Just because of a camera we needed, we went to Belgium and we met Herr Roland, and just because of this remark that I made about these photographs that Herr Roland handed me, and because of the need of them for the Plain Truth magazine, we saw this whole thing develop into Mr. Armstrong going to leaders all over the world as an ambassador for world peace.
Since that first meeting in 1968, God has brought Mr. Armstrong before many of the world's most powerful and influential men and women. The walls of Mr. Armstrong's study in Pasadena are lined with mementos of those visits, gifts from the leaders of great nations and small. Some are still in office. Others are no more, victims of old age, of political intrigue, or sometimes the assassin's bullet. Sincere leaders like Anwar Sadat of Egypt, whose dreams of peace were ahead of the violent times in which he lived.
Incidentally, Mr. President, I want to say one thing right straight from the heart. I respect and admire you more than I can tell you, because you have risked everything in an effort for peace, and your heart has to be in it, it has to be genuine, and not many will do that. I meet heads of state all over the world, but I have not known one that would risk what you did of acquiring the enmity of the Arab world in order to have peace. Now that takes courage, and you have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I'm going to let the world know it, because I reach a part of the world.
Very good. Very good.
Less than a year later, Anwar el-Sadat lost his life for the peace he sought. Shortly after the assassination of President Sadat, Mr. Armstrong returned to Egypt.
I was out to the memorial yesterday where President Sadat lies buried. I did give a little salute, and I just said quietly, well, goodbye, my friend.
But leadership must continue, and the reins of government were passed on to the new Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak. During this trip, Mr. Armstrong met with the new leader of Egypt.
I'm not in politics. I'm an observer. I just look on. I represent God, Allah, and all people. Not any one nation, not any one religion, not any one government. But I'm a friend of all, and I work for peace among all nations. And that is a contribution to peace. And as I say, we are not going to be able to bring peace ourselves. It'll be brought to us.
In the cause of world peace, no region of the world is more crucial than the Middle East. This is the arena in which the fate of civilization will one day be settled. Mr. Armstrong has traveled often in this troubled area. He has kept friendly ties with leaders of both sides of the conflict, such as King Hussein of Jordan, President Suleiman Frangieh of Lebanon, Prime Minister Hedi Nouira of Tunisia, and Prime Ministers Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Menachem Begin of Israel. Focal point of the Middle East's troubles is Jerusalem.